think a lot of people squander an opportunity to free their family from fiat forever with 0.1 Bitcoin. We haven't even begun to see Bitcoin's true purchasing power, which is why I think 0.1 Bitcoin is going to be generational wealth for sure. What is the price of one Bitcoin when you've got 8 billion people fighting over 1 million coins? Michael Saylor, a billionaire with a $9 billion net worth, the CEO of the company with the 7th largest treasury, is directly telling you, you have 10 years left. If we've got $450 trillion of hypothetical demand for Bitcoin, you've got a multiplier effect of 5. That means the price of Bitcoin gets you somewhere around a $2 quadrillion market cap. Then you can divide by the 21 million coins, and you're looking at a price tag of Bitcoin somewhere around $100 million per coin.
Mr. Luke Mikic, thank you so much for being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters. Thank you for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me back again. I didn't scare the listeners off with my first appearance with this dirty Australian accent, I hope.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. So the big thing we want to talk about here today is kind of walk people through this crisis we are in. There's a massive crisis on hand, and it's retirement. It's having wealth, and the system is broken. Saving dollars virtually guarantees poverty. It does. 401ks are a scam. They're underfunded. The Social Security and pensions are going bankrupt. Again, factually going bankrupt. These are things that, again, people at the top don't want us to know. Luke, I would love you to break this down today. What are your thoughts on this retirement crisis and this debate about how much Bitcoin you need to retire and secure your future?
Yes, I mean, we're living through a retirement crisis, a cost of living crisis. Everybody's aware of it because life continues to get exponentially more expensive. 50 years ago, you only needed $50,000 to retire. Now, if you've got $50,000, it couldn't even buy a Toyota Corolla, let alone retire you and your family for 20 or 30 years. So that's why everybody is so focused on this debate and this really hot topic of retirement. And this is why a lot of people are looking at Bitcoin and they're saying, hang on a minute, if Bitcoin continues doing what it's doing, maybe this could fundamentally change how we think of retirement. And this is where a lot of people have said, all right, if Bitcoin does become a major asset in the world, let's start out conservative. Let's not even assume Bitcoin takes over as global money of the world. Let's just assume it becomes digital gold, or, it becomes a large blue chip like equity. And it's crazy to hear those words come out of my mouth. A lot of people think Bitcoin, blue chip equity alongside Apple, Amazon, Facebook. Well, it's already there, baby. It's at $2 trillion market cap as we speak. It's a top 10 largest assets in the world. It is amongst that top 10, which is crazy to think about in only 16 years. But if Bitcoin just continues doing what it's doing, it is going to fundamentally change the lives of those people who own Bitcoin. It will not only enable them and their family to retire, but it could even create dynasties for future generations. Like, that is the potential that Bitcoin has. And it's all because Bitcoin is fundamentally different from fiat. Okay. So in fiat, 50 years ago, you needed $50,000 to retire. Now it's $1 million. In some places, you can't even retire on $1 million. In Australia, in Canada, in America, good luck trying to retire with $1 million. It's impossible. But if you think about things in a Bitcoin world, all of a sudden that's very different. Because instead of retirement getting exponentially more expensive, like it does in fiat, because your currency continues to lose money at an exponential rate, in Bitcoin, things are a little bit different. If you have one Bitcoin, you know exactly how much Bitcoin you're going to own in the future. You're going to own 1/21 millionth of the entire Bitcoin network. Again, there's only 21 million coins. If you are able to accumulate one Bitcoin, you know that nobody's going to be able to dilute your share of the Bitcoin network. It's very different to the world of fiat. In the world of fiat, look what happened in 2020. 40% of all of the money that's ever been created was created in under 1 year. That means your government essentially just robbed you of 40% of your time and energy. Like, think about that. Play that to its logical conclusion. If you've worked 50 years of your life, if you've got $1 million in your retirement account, all of a sudden, overnight, your retirement money was made 40% less valuable. So if you've spent 50 years of your life working for that $1 million, the government has effectively just stolen 25 years of your life, nearly half of your working life, nearly half of the years that it took you to build that $1 million in retirement. And again, this is in America, the most economically stable country in the world. Think about things in other countries, like Zimbabwe recently. Zimbabwe they just moved to a gold-backed currency, and the government said, we will never ever print money again. We will never devalue the currency again. After they've been through many bouts of hyperinflation over the past 5 or 10 years, they said, that's it, enough's enough. We're going to create a gold-backed currency. That lasted for about a year. The government overnight just said 39% devaluation. We're going to steal all your money again. So people are slowly coming to the realization that you cannot retire in dollars or fiat. You cannot retire in something that you do not know what the supply is going to be in the future. This is where Bitcoin's fundamentally different, because families all of a sudden are assured. They know exactly what percentage of that Bitcoin network they're going to own in the future. And this is why I keep banging the drum, so to say, about this importance of accumulating 1 Bitcoin or even 0.1 Bitcoin. I think right now, if there's 10 million Bitcoin on exchanges, if there's 10 million Bitcoin available for sale, which is what I think is probably the available supply today in Bitcoin, it's not 21 million. We know 4 to 5 million Bitcoin are lost forever. And we know at least 4 to 5 million other coins are in hands of hodlers who have not sold in more than 5 years. So I think there's only 10 million Bitcoin available for sale today. And I think there's only enough Bitcoin for 100 million families to be freed from fiat forever. That's what I think 0.1 Bitcoin is. If there's 10 million Bitcoin in exchanges, if I'm saying 0.1 Bitcoin can be generational wealth in the future, that means there are 100 million people on the planet today who could accumulate generational wealth. It's not many people. So again, I think the race is on, and we all know things are not going to shake out distributed in an even fashion. And I think that, we can really start talking about where I think Bitcoin's going in the future and why most people are bearish. And that will probably help to explain why I've landed on this 0.1 Bitcoin figure and why I think that could be generational wealth.
Yeah, and you touched beautifully on some of these things. I mean, the 401ks, I think the average in America is like $130,000 in their 401ks. Again, people can't retire on that. Social Security, that's the other thing people rely on. That's, we know, going bankrupt, for sure going bankrupt. I mean, these things are facts. So I think that's where the setup to this is why it's so important. Again, I was talking to somebody recently and she was like, we know this route. We know 100% this route is a dead end. We know it's bankrupt. We know it's done. And for so many people that have this really hard time getting on that lifeboat, they have a hard time getting off the Titanic, this fiat debt-based Titanic, the dollar, and off their 401k and pension and Social Security, and they have a hard time getting that life, even though they know it's going down. I mean, so many more people are waking up. That's what's really wild to me, is that, yes, it's a scary ocean, and there's this little lifeboat here, but we know the ship's going down, and people still have this cognitive dissonance. It's truly wild. So saving in dollars has, as we can see, literally making people poor over time and affecting families, generations of families. So the plan, though, going forward is, like you kind of just alluded to, perfect segue is how, 0.1 Bitcoin, even a little bit of Bitcoin can make you very wealthy and able to retire eventually. So I'd love you to unpack some of this and talk about the supply dynamics, adoption and equaling exponential price increases, the total addressable market, what's happening here that is going to give people this seismic advantage with people, these early adopters to Bitcoin.
Yeah, so if we're going to talk about why 0.1 Bitcoin could make you rich, we need to understand what is Bitcoin's wealth. What is Bitcoin's worth? What is its total addressable market cap? Where is Bitcoin going to be in the future? And I would encourage the listeners to do their own calculations, run their own maths. I'm just going to walk you guys through how I think about the world. So I think there's $900 trillion of wealth in the world today, $300 trillion of real estate, $300 trillion of debt. You got $100 trillion in fiat, $100 trillion in bond. Everybody's aware of that. We got $19 trillion in gold. And I think like 70 to 80% of the world's wealth has been put there in inferior store of value asset classes. Money is no longer functioning as money, and that's why the real estate market is grossly overvalued. So I've run the numbers on this, and I've written 8,000 word articles looking at the monetary premium in each bucket, whether that be the bond market, the debt market, the real estate market. I ran all the maths, I ran all the numbers. I think there's, for example, a 70 to 80% monetary premium in the global real estate market. So if you have a look at house prices pre-1970, when we were on a gold standard, when we were using money that actually stored value, the average home cost somewhere between 2 to 3 times the average person's income. Today it's 7, 8, 9 in Sydney, Australia. It's like 15x the average person's income. So if you run the numbers, there's about $280 trillion in the global real estate market that's purely there looking for a store of value. It's not like real estate is priced at its utility value. What we're looking at in this $900 trillion pool of money is money just simply looking for a home. So you guys can run your own numbers, but I think it's pretty conservative to assume that half of that money will flow into Bitcoin in the next couple of decades. I personally think it's going to happen a lot quicker, but again, let's be conservative. Let's say it's going to take 2 decades. Well, if you've got $450 trillion of demand coming into Bitcoin, what a lot of people forget is that not all 21 million Bitcoin are actually available for sale. So this is where we get into this thing called the multiplier effect. Over the past 4 years, this multiplier effect has averaged somewhere around 5x. So that means for every $1 that flows into Bitcoin, it actually pushes the Bitcoin market cap up by 5x. And this is very important to know if you want to start thinking about what price one Bitcoin could be in the future. So if you just run the numbers, if we've got $450 trillion of hypothetical demand for Bitcoin, that's if half the world's wealth wants to flow into Bitcoin, you've got a multiplier effect of 5. That means the price of Bitcoin gets you somewhere around a $2 quadrillion market cap. Then you can divide by the 21 million coins, and you look at a price tag of Bitcoin somewhere around $100 million per coin. And that's in today's purchasing power. This doesn't account for hyperinflation. This is only looking at the money available in the world today. One Bitcoin should be worth somewhere around $100 million per coin. And just look at the purchasing power that gives you. It would buy you 10 to 15 Malibu beach houses in California. They go for about $10 million a pop. And again, this is where we start coming to the realization, okay, how much do you need to retire? If Bitcoin does get to crazy lofty targets like that, I don't think you need 1 Bitcoin to retire. Maybe you can do it with 0.1 Bitcoin. That would be worth $10 million. So this, again, I think it's really important context and framing, because a lot of people are just wildly too bearish on Bitcoin. A lot of people don't understand the history of technology. They don't understand monetary transitions. And most people just can't think in an exponential fashion. Like today, global Bitcoin adoption is less than 1%. And we've gone from 0 to $100,000 per coin. To anybody thinking I'm crazy for saying Bitcoin could hit $100 million a coin, ask yourself, what happens when the other 99% of the world figure out they need to buy Bitcoin? We've gone from 0 to $100,000 a coin with 1% of the world owning this thing and taking self-custody of this thing. This has happened during a time where 95% of all of the Bitcoin that will ever be created has been mined. So over the next 16 years of Bitcoin's life, we're 16 years old today, we're only going to watch another million coins get mined, probably less, and 99% of the world flood into this thing. Price isn't going from 100,000 to 200,000. This is the thing people don't get about exponential change. It doesn't work like that. It's going to be going from 100,000 to 100 million. These orders of magnitude are just so difficult for most people to understand. And Bitcoin is so early in its adoption curve. I don't think a lot of people have been recognizing the exponential change we've been living through since 2020. I don't think a lot of people have recognized that Bitcoin's fundamentally changed post 2020. Just because right now Bitcoin is still following old models like a power law model, I think a lot of people are setting themselves up to be surprised to the upside, and I think squander an opportunity to free their family from fiat forever with 0.1 Bitcoin. And I think that's purely because they're not thinking about the bigger picture. They're not thinking about what Bitcoin could be worth. And I think CK Snarks puts it best. He kind of popularized an idea saying that, look, Bitcoin is a binary bet. It's either going to take over the world, it's going to become the new global reserve currency, unit of account, and primary store of value, or it's going to fail and it's going to go to zero. I 100% agree with that. I think the least likely outcome is Bitcoin just becomes another asset. It's just digital gold. It's just $500,000 a coin for the next 20 years. I think that's incredibly unlikely. And I've put my money where my mouth is. I think there's a 99.99% probability that Bitcoin is what we think it is. It is the greatest invention in human history. It's a once in a species invention. It is the thing that all of a sudden gives us something to store value in the digital realm. Until Bitcoin was created, you could not create scarcity in the digital realm. We've done it. And I think what we're watching and what we're living through is, for the first time in the 7,000 years of monetary history, we're watching value transition from the analog world to the digital world. We're in the midst of this transition, and just pinch yourself. It's pretty crazy that out of the 7,000 years, in the 20, 30, or 40, or 50, or 60, or 70 years of age that you might be today, you get to watch this transition. And this is only going to happen once. Are you taking advantage of this transition? I don't think most people are.
I'd love for you to expand on this a little bit. I saw a tweet from American Hodl earlier, and it was about Bitcoin being infinite. Now it's funny because I always think of Bitcoin and how I've told the people over time that Bitcoin is a finite container for equal to your finite time and energy. And so it's this perfect trade. It's the only trade a smart investor would make, in my opinion. We have our time and energy, which is we only get so much on Earth, and you have to trade that. If you're working, have you labor, whatever it is you're doing, providing a good and service, and you have to make a trade. Now, most people have been trading that for dollars or yen or lira, or whatever it is, something with a hole, an inflationary hole in it. And so it's seeping out your time and energy. And so Bitcoin is the first time that it's perfectly finite, equally finite with your finite time and energy on Earth. And so that's why, to me, it's a perfect pair, trading pair. And it's the first one we've ever seen in human history. And American Hodl was talking about that finite container that I call it. He was saying that Bitcoin is infinite money. And so it goes to what you're saying here of like this exponential, like he was saying that the purchasing power of Bitcoin is infinite. That container can hold infinite amounts of purchasing power. So that to me, I think is the hardest thing that people have a hard time grasping. It's like you guys are talking all these crazy numbers and what's happening. What is it to you, I guess, that people are missing when they can't see what is possible with Bitcoin, this exponential? Obviously we're not exponential creatures, but what is that thing that people are missing when they're trying to put this together and not understanding how high and how much purchasing power Bitcoin can really have?
For me, it's people aren't paying attention to what happened in the past 4 years. So we now have people like Michael Saylor, who is 1 billionaire. He owns 500,000 coins. There's 21 million Bitcoin. There's only enough Bitcoin in history for 40 other billionaires to do what Michael Saylor's done and buy 500,000 coins. Now, Michael Saylor actually understands Bitcoin. He says it every interview. I'm buying Bitcoin. I'm holding it for 100 years. This is pristine Manhattan real estate that you do not buy and sell. You simply buy it, you leverage against it, and you pass that down into future generations because this is generational wealth. Everybody is coming to cyberspace. So with that framing, this is where people haven't run the numbers. One person has just bought 500,000 coins. Only 40 entities can do that in the entire world. There's 150 plus nation states. There's 3,000 other billionaires like Michael Saylor. There's 58,000 public companies. There's 330 million businesses. You don't think all of them want to do what Michael Saylor's done and buy 500,000 coins? I think they are going to do what Michael Saylor's done. And I just think it's inevitable. It's only a matter of time. And things get really wonky because my base case is that in 15 years' time,
If you're liking this interview, but you're just wondering, hey, you know what, Brandon, this is amazing stuff. And I get you have these guests on and they're talking about how orange pilling the world is so great and how Bitcoin is going to take over the world. How in the world do I educate my family and friends? How do I get people to understand what most people just don't care about, quite honestly? Bitcoin trading cards is the way to do that. When you open up these cards, you see the foil cards, you see the chase, you see the glossy cards, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, it doesn't matter. People love these cards. It's awesome because they're super valuable, by the way. Amazing little side note. However, it Trojan horses them into the most important thing of the day. It's not politics. It's not all the things that we fight about. It's changing the money, fix the world. Bitcoin trading cards is the best way that we have going in order to do that, no matter who you are. You're going to love them. Playable Characters 10 for 10% off at checkout. Playable Characters 10, 10% off at checkout. btc-tc.com. You're going to absolutely love these things. Now back to the show.
19 million coins are probably going to be in the hands. Let me retract that a little bit. But what I will say is that I don't know the number, but there might only be 1 or 2 million coins available for the other 99.99% of the world to buy and trade and use as a medium of exchange. Now, what I mean is I think Bitcoin's going to become this strategic reserve asset, like the largest nation state in the world just announced it will be in America, the global reserve currency holder. And when something is a global strategic reserve asset for a nation state or a treasury of a corporation, you don't sell the thing. You buy the thing and you hold it for 100 years. So I don't think it's an extrapolation to say just what if another 40 billionaires figure it out. Like, billionaires are smart. I'm actually going to do the maths for you guys live during this interview. There's 3,000 billionaires. Only 40 of them can do what Michael Saylor's done. Let's run the maths and see what percentage of the smartest and most successful business minds in the entire world could do what Michael Saylor's done. 0.0133%. Do you guys really think, what is that? Is that 1.3% of the world's billionaires will figure it out and be smart enough to figure out what Michael Saylor's done? The smartest, richest, most successful people in the world. Again, money is simply a leaderboard. Like, yes, some people get lucky. Some people get lucky and they get rich. But I think the majority of people who are rich, they get there because they're smart, because they're hustlers, because they're motivated, because they figure things out, because they switch on to new trends, because they're forward thinking. Bitcoin is the most forward thinking thing in the world today. And I just think it's wild that people just aren't running the numbers. Do we really think 1% of the world's billionaires won't figure it out? I believe that's actually 0.1% of the world's billionaires won't figure it out and want to buy more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor. And this is just why I'm incredibly bullish. This is what I think everybody's missing. People just don't understand true scarcity. They don't understand one billionaire in the past 4 years just bought 500,000 coins. Only 40 other people can do that in the entire world. Nation states, public corporations, or individuals. And when we get there, it's like, what is the price of one Bitcoin when you've got 8 billion people fighting over 1 million coins? And this is just going to continue getting even more crazy, and people are going to call it centralized. But in 20 or 30 years' time, the globe's, the entire GDP of the world might be operating off 100,000 coins. What is one coin worth if you've got 800,000 people fighting over 100,000 coins? What is one Bitcoin worth? It's not hundreds of thousands. It's not millions. It's not tens of millions. It's not even hundreds of millions. One Bitcoin's going to be worth billions of dollars in purchasing power today. People hear that, they think I'm crazy, but I just encourage you guys, really extrapolate this thing out. Like, what happens when the other billionaires realize the only way to be richer than Michael Saylor is to buy more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor? What happens when they realize that there's 21 million coins? There's only 2.5 million coins on exchanges today. That's enough Bitcoin for 5 billionaires to come in and buy more Bitcoin than Michael Saylor. this is so inevitable. It's going to happen. I've been screaming it from the rooftops for the past 4 years. Something changed in 2020. We're in a new era of Bitcoin's life. And when the number of Bitcoin on exchanges hits zero by somewhere around 2028, 2029, or 2030, we're going to find out the real price of Bitcoin. And I think until we see zero Bitcoin on exchanges, we haven't even begun to see Bitcoin's true purchasing power, which is why I think 0.1 Bitcoin is going to be generational wealth for sure.
I got to share these cards, the Bitcoin trading cards. I know you're a big fan of them. This is why you do what you do. Bitcoin news, many people you help in the Bitcoin space. This is why what you were just talking about is so important. It's the education for the average person. The globalists, all these people, they don't have Bitcoin trading cards. They're not watching, well, maybe they're watching Bitcoin news. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe some of them are at this point, but these interviews, but we're trying to get the average person in the game. I think really, you and I have talked, just over time. And I think this is what the average Bitcoiner, especially content creator, is trying to do is to educate the average person that we're in this Bitcoin bull run the next 10 years until the 99% of the supply is gone. And I think that's why this is so important, because obviously nations are coming in, these massive entities are coming in, and then it changes. So these next two questions I have for you have to do with this very topic. And it's, the worst mistake you can make is, number one, not buying Bitcoin, not getting in the game, or not working for Bitcoin, but also selling your Bitcoin. And then I want to touch on after that is, why fiat is dying and what comes next once we're on that Bitcoin standard. So I would love for you to touch on first this, the mistake of not buying, but we've touched on a little bit, but more importantly, selling your Bitcoin. What are we going to do in order to bridge this gap over the next, say, call it 5, 10, 15 years before we get to this Bitcoinized world?
Yeah, people just need to understand how scarce this Bitcoin thing is. And when you understand that, you're not going to want to sell it. And you do start to appreciate scarcity. That's what I love about the trading cards. They're scarce, like Bitcoin, like time. It's a beautiful thing about them. And they also educate people, which is, again, incredibly important. The reason why people don't sell Bitcoin, because they're not educated. And I think a lot of people struggle with education about Bitcoin because it's not tangible. Bitcoin's not tangible. It's this digital thing. It's sometimes a little bit more difficult to wrap their heads around. This is why whenever I meet someone and they ask me about Bitcoin, I don't even answer their question. I just say, you know what, how about I show you how Bitcoin is? I'll download a wallet onto their phone. And before I even start fielding questions about Bitcoin, I just say, how about I just show you what it is? Because a lot of people are like, Bitcoin's complicated. And I just say, Bitcoin's money without banks. This is how it works. Is that interesting? And then they typically ask more questions. But this is why I love, again, physical demonstrations of what Bitcoin is when we're talking about education, and physical products like trading cards. Get in the hands, it's more tangible. And when people do understand that, hang on a minute, there is something real and tangible to Bitcoin, that's when they start falling down the rabbit hole. That's when they understand that, hang on a minute, this thing is something I don't sell. This is something I should never sell. I should only buy this thing. And that's what good money should be. And it's just really difficult for our society to understand that. It's because most of us alive today, have grown up in an era where we haven't had money to store value. And since 1971, the world got pushed forcibly off the gold standard without a choice, without a vote. Richard Nixon just said, we are temporarily suspending your currency's convertibility to gold. You can no longer take those little pieces of paper into the bank and get gold out. No, said, sorry, you don't get a vote in it. So again, most of us have lived in this world where it's natural to not value those pieces of paper, because I don't even wipe my ass with them. They're not worth anything. They are valueless. Okay. So that's why I think it's going to be such a mental shift to adopt Bitcoin. And when that shift really starts happening, it's going to happen all at once. And this all ties into that topic about exponential change. Things are going to happen much quicker than most people think. And I don't think even most Bitcoiners are quite prepared for some of the volatility that we're going to see in this pretty wild transition.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, people have a very hard time seeing this transition, like this phase transition. I honestly think, I would love your thoughts on this, actually. Are we you mentioned Richard Nixon, are we in a Bretton Woods, what is it, 4 at this point. I mean, we had Bretton Woods 1, we had Bretton Woods 2 is 1971, at least in theory. In Bretton Woods 3, again, theoretically, as many people have kind of coined it, was what happened with freezing Russians' assets, their dollars, in 2022. Are we at Bretton Woods 4? Like, are we going to look back 10, 15, 20, 100 years from now, I guess, and say, hey, we were in this monetary transition where the Trump administration came in, all these people came in, hardcore Bitcoiners, and we were phased transitioning to this new standard. At least it's what it seems like to me, where we're kind of revaluing the monetary system in terms of hard assets. Whether it's gold and silver have been going up, obviously, recently, and we have Bitcoin being added, the strategic reserve. What do you see here? I'd love you to unpack your thoughts on kind of where we are in this timeline, because it feels like that's where we are.
Yeah, so again, people think this is hyperbolic when I say things like this, and I'm going to justify what I'm about to say with a lot of data, facts, and history of cycles. But I've got a chapter in my book, and the title of the chapter is The 2020s, the most important decade in our civilization's history. And I genuinely believe that. I think the 2020s is going to be the most interesting decade of human history. We, right now, are living through this monetary transition that we're talking about. Okay, we really zoom out. Right now, we're at the end of an 80-year long-term debt cycle. Historically, these kind of things unwind in 10-year chapters. Their unwinding began in 2020. We can see there's lots of data backing this up. Hirschman Capital, massive hedge fund, they ran a report looking back at the past 225 years of data, and they said that once a government reaches 130% debt to GDP levels, typically that government defaults on its debt within 15 years. So they found that there's a 98.6% probability of a government defaulting on its debt within 15 years. So they looked at 52 governments, 51 of them defaulted on their debt. The way governments typically default on their debt, they don't say, hey, we're over indebted, sorry, pack up the game. They say, we're over indebted, we're going to steal your money. And we're going to do that through taxation, capital controls, printing money out of the wazoo. Okay, very simple. You print money, you devalue the existing money, you pay back your old debt with the devalued dollars. Okay, this is how governments default. 51 out of 52 times this has happened since 1800. We default in 15 years. America, the global reserve currency holder, hit that 130% debt to GDP level in 2020. I don't want to get into the weeds. I don't want to get into the rabbit hole, but there's a lot of data there suggesting that, hey, we're at the end of this 80-year long-term debt cycle. We're also at the end of this 90-year fourth turning cycle. I believe we're also in the transition of this 250-year revolutionary cycle. We're also at the end of this 50-year tech cycle that began in the 1770s. And we are just right now, we're in a decade where all of this chaos and cycles just seem to be unwinding. And I think, again, it's really interesting because you can look at technology adoption cycles. And this is where things get really wonky with Bitcoin. And this is why I call Bitcoin the economic singularity. It's been the working title of my book for 3 years that I still haven't published. But Bitcoin technologies get adopted in exponential waves. Everybody knows that. Okay. So if we look at the technologies, I'm going to tie all this together, I promise. If you look at the technologies, automobile, the internet, and the smartphone, on average, took them 12 years to go from 0 to 10% adoption. Very slow growth in those first 12 years. You hit an inflection point, and then adoption goes exponential. And on average, those three technologies, they went from 10% adoption to 90% adoption in the same 10-year window that it took them to go from 0 to 10% adoption. So again, I think that's an interesting mental framework for Bitcoin. Bitcoin's 16 years old today. You can measure Bitcoin adoption in lots of different ways. That's a different rabbit hole that I could talk about for 5 minutes pretty comfortably. But I kind of think it's interesting that I think Bitcoin's kind of showing signs over the past 4 years that it's in this new era. For the first time in Bitcoin's life, coins have been leaving the exchanges precipitously for 5 years, since 2020, when I think the big money realized what Bitcoin was. So I do think it's interesting that I think Bitcoin is kind of coiled to go through this period of exponential adoption in the 2020s. Who knows what date, what time, what year? I don't know when it's going to happen. I do think it's going to come quicker than most people think. And it kind of aligns with all of these other cycles. Because what is the solution to an 80-year long-term debt cycle that we're living through the unwinding of? Sound money. What is the solution of a 90-year fourth turning cycle where you see a lot of political instability, riots, capital confiscations like we saw in the previous fourth turning in the 1930s? Again, what did FDR, Mussolini, and Hitler all want to do? They wanted to steal your money. And this is always why these fourth turning cycles always kind of coincide with these 80-year long-term debt cycles. Again, what's the solution to a fourth turning for the individual and the nation state? It's Bitcoin. It's sound money. Then you look at the technology K-wave cycles. So if you look since 1770, we've had new revolutionary technologies created every single 50 years that have fundamentally transformed the global economy. Industrial revolution, steam engines, railways. Then we had electricity and steel. And then 50 years later, we had the automobile and the oil revolution. And after that automobile and oil revolution in the early 1900s, 50 years later, what happened? The invention of the microprocessor. This obviously drove the entire digital wave that we saw, the internet bubble in the early 2000s. But what comes 50 years after the early 1960s? It's around the 2010 era. What was the technological revolution that we're living through today that's going to transform the global economy over the next 50 years? Some people think it's AI. Some people think it's 3D printing. Some people think it's encryption. I fundamentally believe it's Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin is also the solution or the thing that happens every 50 years. We see these technological revolutions. And lots of people have made videos saying, is Bitcoin the fifth industrial revolution, the fifth technological revolution in these waves of tech innovations that happen every 50 years? And I fundamentally disagree. I actually don't think it is. I actually think it's much bigger. And again, in my book, I've made the case that Bitcoin is actually far more akin to the industrial revolution. And Bitcoin is actually going to create the next era of 250 years of growth for the digital realm, kind of like the industrial revolution did in the early 1770s. Again, 250 years ago. Our civilization was pretty amateur, not very advanced. We were literally living in dirt, living in villages, banging rocks together 250 years ago. There were no megacities, there were no factories, no machines, no cars for thousands of years, if not millions of years. The top moving speed that our civilization achieved was like 3 to 4 miles per hour. That's how quick you could be on the back of a horse. And that was the quickest we could figure out for millions of years, right? Over distance. Okay, yes, you could run faster than 3 miles an hour for 100 meters, but over distance, that's the quickest we could move as a civilization. All the way up until the 1770s. Then we create steam engines. Then we create cars. Then we create rockets. And in only 160 years, our civilization's top speed over distance went from 3 miles per hour to something like 25,000 miles per hour when we launched a rocket to the moon in the 1960s. So this just goes to say people don't understand exponential change. And I really do think Bitcoin's a lot bigger than most people think. It is the industrial revolution for cyberspace, for the digital realm. It is also the next sequence, it's the next thing in this 250-year revolutionary cycle we see. So what's interesting is every 250 years, we see a big revolution. So the early 1500s, a technology, the printing press, created the separation of church and state, the Gutenberg printing press. All it did was decentralize and democratize information for everyone. 250 years later, exactly 250 years later, from the 1520s to the 1770s, we saw the two largest revolutions in human history, French and American Revolution. What's 250 years forward from the 1770s? It's the 2020s. I think it's awfully poetic, and I just think Bitcoin is, just like the printing press, it's going to do something very similar. It's going to separate money from state for the first time in human history, the same way the Gutenberg printing press separated the church and the state in the 1500s. So I think, like, it's a long answer, but I think what we're living through right now, it's unprecedented. It's huge. It's big. It's a once in a species transition. And again, most people really aren't zooming out and thinking about Bitcoin within this much broader context.
Only you can say it that well. That's for sure, Luke. So it makes me think of some of these things that we're dealing with right now. I mean, you're talking about, history, obviously, which is so important to obviously know where we're at now and where we're going. And it's, fiat is dying. We've kind of outlined a lot of this. We've talked about the death spiral before, inflation, the debt problems, what Doge is doing, all of these issues that we're coming up with. Central banks scrambling right now. The EU literally like years ago talked about, I don't know if it was just Bitcoiners or whoever was talking about, well, I guess the Cyprus bail-ins, but people, they were going to steal the citizens' wealth. Well, here we are, like that's the EU just this week say, well, we're going to steal the people's wealth. We have 10 must be 10 trillion. I would imagine it must be 10 trillion in deposits that they're going to steal to create their CBDC, their enslavement coin. Wild times, absolutely wild times. So we have this world where stable coins are coming in. Obviously the American government is making a push for this to extend dollar dominance. This is all going to play out, but as Bitcoiners know, this is what we for 16 years have been saying was going to happen. And then it was going to lead to Bitcoin being the only money. So I would love your thoughts on just some of these things, whether it's the debt spiral or just even the competition we're going to see here between possible speaking of history, going back to the 1800s of free banking and different currencies. They have JPM coin, these different banks that they say, hey, Scott Besson's like, yeah, let's create different coins to have them compete. It's a wild world we're in. EU stealing their citizens' wealth. I mean, it's like it's sad. You have to laugh almost, but it's sad. I mean, where are we in this timeline? And at that point, we know Bitcoin wins, and this is going to come into Bitcoin is the only money. So what happens when Bitcoin is the only money and there's not this, there's a fiat price associated with it? So I'd love for you to touch on that first thing, but also transition into fiat or being gone and Bitcoin being the only money in existence.
Yeah, I can't remember the lady's last name, but Ursula.
Ursula von der Leyen and Lagarde, both of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw Ursula's tweet this week saying, essentially, we can't wait to turn private savings into investment. They're literally saying we're going to steal your wealth and we're going to reallocate the capital. And a lot of people, I think, are just numb to these things, but Bitcoiners have been watching these headlines come out for years. And I mean, they're coming. Like the bank bail-ins scared me in 2016, 2017. That's what pushed me to start buying gold in like 2015, 2016, before I found Bitcoin in 2017. Yes, I was the weird 18-year-old kid with gold under my mattress as an 18-year-old. It was very strange, and I've always been pretty shameless to just be a quirky kid. But what drove me to be a gold bug before a Bitcoiner was all of these dominoes lining up in 2016, 2017. Europe, Australia, the UK, they're all talking about bank bail-ins. What's a bail-in? Most people have heard about a bailout. That's when, if there's a financial crisis and the bank goes bankrupt, they print the money to give it to the bank. That's how they steal your wealth. They print the money, they devalue the money, and they give it to all the big banker friends, right? This is what happened in 2020. This is a classic case of a bank bailout. What happened was, in America in particular, there was $6 trillion printed in America in 2020. And a lot of people think, I got my $1,200 stimmy check. I'm golden. I did great. My government gave me free money to wear a face diaper and look like a clown and follow all of these ridiculous laws for 3 years. I'm going to be careful what I say here. But all I will say that people forget about the hysteria of that very interesting year, 2020, was if you actually run the numbers and if you divide 6 trillion by the 350 million or so American population, the amount of money the country printed was something like, I forget the exact number, but it was like $18,000 per head. The average family got a $1,500 stimmy check. So where did the other $16,500 go per person? Of course, it went to bankers. It went to the billionaires. It went to, again, there's nothing wrong with the billionaires, but it went to the very connected politicians. Okay, this is a typical bank bailout. They print the money and they just give it to the banks. Now a bail-in is very different. In a bail-in, they don't even try to hide it. They don't even throw you a $1,500 stimmy check and say, there you go, peasant, take some of those crumbs off the table and lick my boots. They don't even say that. It's very explicit. A bail-in is exactly what happened in Cyprus 10 years ago, or Greece, or Nigeria last year. They just steal the money straight out of people's banks and they say sorry. Or it happened in Lebanon just 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
A typical bail-in is the government's just steal your money. So anyway, another long explanation. But I saw all of these bail-in laws being passed in European countries, the UK and Australia in 2017. And the writing was on the wall. I was telling all my friends about it 10 years ago. And I said, you're going to want to own some gold and some Bitcoin. And the data speaks for itself. The tyrannical oppression that we've seen over the past 10 years speaks for itself. And that trend is only going to accelerate because one of the other very interesting exponential trends of adoption that I pay so much attention to is the exponential rise of digital nomads. Okay, again, this is related. I'll tie it back. But in 2018, there was 4 million digital nomads in the entire world. So if you say this kind of internet revolution started in the year 2000, it took 18 years for 4 million digital nomads to figure out that working online, living elsewhere, and not paying taxes was a superior thing they should do for their business. So that's 2018. Today it's 2025. There's 35 million digital nomads. We've been growing by 4 to 5 million digital nomads every single year since 2018. So what does this do to governments? Naturally, governments have a lot of debt. How do they pay back that debt? One way is they print the money, devalue the money, pay back the debt with the devalued dollars. Second way, they raise taxes on the entrepreneurs. What happens when all the entrepreneurs leave the country like they are at a breakneck pace right now? Those people staying to live in that country, life gets even worse for them because then it's like an exponential feedback loop. If the people paying all the taxes are leaving and saying, adios, I'm out of here, ciao, I'm going to go live in Peru with Luke. People say, oh shit, the government has to print more money. Okay. When I say adios, all of a sudden I'm not paying taxes to the government. And typically the top 1% of a population or the top 1% of the businesses pay 50% of the taxes. So if the top 1% of a country leaves, that's potentially 50% of the tax base gone. How's the government going to get all that money back? Well, they're going to open up the borders and let all sorts of illegals into the country to buy the overinflated properties, to keep that property pyramid scheme going. They're going to have to print more money and they're going to have to raise taxes on the existing people. And then eventually the existing people who have been watching me live like a nutcase for the past 3 years and not have a home, my friends who are watching me live this experience, they're all of a sudden starting to think, hey, Luke looks like he's having a little bit of fun. You know, I mean, he's not bankrupt. He's having some fun. He's traveling. He's working online. Maybe I want to do what he's doing. And they start having these thoughts progressively over time. I have progressively got more and more messages from my friends asking me how they can do the same thing I'm doing. And then the government continuously raises taxes. So it's this exponential squeezing function. And the government's going to raise taxes again. Then more people are going to copy me and do what I'm doing. Every day, not every day, at least every week, somebody messages me and says, hey, I love how you went and lived in El Salvador, Bitcoin country, for 6 months and tried to survive on Bitcoin and escaped Australia. I'm doing the same. Connect me with all the people because I want to do it. Like, I get those messages so often. And I just think, like, the more recent news of the ECB trying to confiscate $10 trillion of EU savings, it's just another domino in this long line of tyrannical BS that is slowly but surely being recognized by the world. And this is why we have this exponential trend of digital nomads fleeing their home countries to live abroad. And this is why we're going to continue to see exponential Bitcoin adoption, because it's inevitable. There is no stopping this train. And the more digital nomads that leave, the more crazy the headlines you're going to see in EU countries, supposedly EU democratic countries, are talking about confiscating the wealth of citizens. In China, the CBDC has expiration rates. Capital controls are going to become more and more the norm, and people just aren't paying attention to the trends. That's going to impact them the most.
It's truly remarkable the time we're living in, and it's, eventually we're going to get to a point when this is all happens, fiat's gone, and you can only work for Bitcoin or mine it. That's it, right? And that's really the end game for all this. And again, that's where I think that people have this hard time of, they always get things confused. And we're like, well, you need a dollar price for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is backed by the dollar. All these different things. So I love what you're talking about. It's like the average person gets confused with a lot of these things, and that's why I think it's so important to differentiate these time periods. And that's why we talk about lending against it. That's what we talked about a little bit earlier. Obviously, never selling your Bitcoin. It's going to be generational wealth. So you're never going to want to sell it. You want to lend against it as long as fiat exists. And then when fiat doesn't exist, then okay, now we're trading our Bitcoin. We're doing productive things and trading our Bitcoin for other productive assets. Maybe it is apartment complexes. Maybe it's a grocery store or whatever it is, a farm. So I think these are things that, again, like we have spent a lot of time thinking about over the years, and the average person now is starting to really see that, hey, this is what's going to happen. In saying that, I would love for you to touch on life getting cheaper in Bitcoin. This is something that, again, you briefly touched on earlier. 0.1 Bitcoin being something where you could retire on 0.1 Bitcoin, or maybe it's 0.01 Bitcoin, or maybe it's 1 Bitcoin, but everything in life getting cheaper in terms of Bitcoin, and where fiat, everything keeps getting more expensive. In a Bitcoin standard, as you save in Bitcoin, life continues to get cheaper for you, and understanding deflation and how that really works. And we have these competing systems right now. So I'd love for you to unpack this and how you explain to talk to the people about this.
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating topic because life just gets cheaper when you're living on a Bitcoin standard. I think, like, what was it? Only 4 to 5 years ago, Bitcoin was $10,000 a coin in 2020. The average home in Australia, probably 500,000, per house. So you needed something like 50 Bitcoin to buy the average home in Australia. Today, it's very different. Today, you might need 2 Bitcoin, 3 Bitcoin, 4 Bitcoin to buy the average home in Australia. So it just shows just how quickly that's changing, and that trend's only going to accelerate. This is an exponential process. The 2020, 2021 bull market wasn't even a real bull market. It was a pump for ants. Bitcoin rallied to $65,000. It's peanuts. I genuinely believe we're going much higher this bull run. If you actually ignore the 2021 cycle, and if you have a look at what Bitcoin did in 2013 and 2017, Bitcoin did an average multiple of like 65x. So if you run the numbers and you go from a 65x from the bottom of $16,000 a coin in 2022, Bitcoin, if it simply repeats what it did in 2013 and 2017, the maths is very clear. We're hitting $1 million per coin in 2025. That's just the maths. Just ignore what the 2021 cycle was. So I think the whole idea of diminishing returns is a meme. And I think life's going to get exponentially cheaper on a Bitcoin standard if you can weather the volatility of the next 2, 3, 4 years. And I just think the way I think about it personally is I'm just going to continue to store more than 95 to 99% of my wealth in Bitcoin for the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, because I just don't think Bitcoin's going to be priced appropriately where it should be for at least another 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Like we said earlier, 1% of the world's bought this thing. I mean, the 10-year digital gold rush that Michael Saylor is talking about just started in 2024. I personally think it actually started in 2020 with the trend of coins leaving the exchanges. But the point is fair. Michael Saylor, a billionaire with a $9 billion net worth, the CEO of the company with the 7th largest treasury out of 58,000 public companies, who's met with President Trump multiple times, is directly telling you, you have 10 years left. That's his 10-year digital gold rush thesis. He says it started in 2024 with the launch of the Bitcoin ETFs. He says in 10 years, 99% of the Bitcoin that will ever be created will be mined. He's telling you, supply suffocation is coming. You've got 10 years. I think it started in 2020. I think you've got 5 years left. So again, I think things are going to get really wonky. Things are going to get really interesting when this supply suffocation really starts to play out. And I'm not going to consider selling my Bitcoin for things for a very long time. I will happily rent apartments like I'm doing right now. I'm renting apartments in Lima here in Peru, and I'm going to continue doing that for the foreseeable future. I won't be buying a home for a long time because I just know that 5 years ago cost me 50 Bitcoin to buy a home in Australia. Today it cost me 5 Bitcoin to buy a home in Australia. Just by waiting for 5 years, homes just got 90% cheaper priced in Bitcoin. Same thing's going to happen over the next 5 years, if not to an even bigger degree. Maybe they get 95% cheaper priced in Bitcoin. So why spend your Bitcoin when it's getting so valuable?
Okay, so transitioning to another topic you have kind of surrounding the global economy and how we price things, how the metrics we use. I know you have a little bit of a spicy take here on GDP and how we're going to calculate things on a Bitcoin standard, and how there's the saying of Bitcoin breaks all your models. So I would love for you to touch on GDP and some of these things that are going to change on a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah, so a lot of people expect Bitcoin to fix the Eurodollar market or increase global GDP from 2% to 3% or 2% to 5%, like it has been growing at over the past 10, 20, 30 years. I think it's completely flawed. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Bitcoin is a very binary bet. It's all or nothing. It either goes to zero or it fails, or it becomes global money of the world, and it fundamentally transforms how the global economy works. And if we do, hypothetically, transition to a Bitcoin standard, this is going to fundamentally mean smaller governments. Again, what is a smaller government? That means that they can't print money to enforce all of their stupid bureaucracies and rules and regulations that they use to squeeze capital out of the business owner. That means there's going to be less rules, less regulations, and it's going to mean more capitalism, more business owners, more wealthy individuals creating a business because they actually have an incentive to. For example, in Australia.
Hold up. Over 90% of people that watch this channel don't subscribe to the channel. And we see that metric across all of Bitcoin YouTube and financial YouTube, sound money YouTube. That is crazy. Let big tech know that people want what they are getting here. They want sound money education. They want more truth. We do that by subscribing, and it also gives more resources to the content creators to provide more for you. I'm a consumer as well. I love watching this. This is why I give back. It's a calling inside, but I also learned so much over the last 15 years from YouTube that I want to give back to the community that gave so much to me. So I thank you more than you know. Please subscribe to the other channels. Now back to the episode.
If I wanted to start a business, I don't want to start a business in Australia because I have to give the government 50% of my money to go and fund all of these ludicrous ideas. It's bad enough that I have to give the government 50% of my money. What's even worse is when they take that money and they use that to imprison me. I pay the government 50% of the money I make a year, and I have police officers chasing me on the beach in 2020, trying to pin me down and put 5 masks on my face. This is where my tax money goes. And again, it goes all sorts of other stupid, wonky places as well. All the woke mind virus that swept the world over the past 2 to 3 years, a little bit less to a lesser degree more recently. But there's no incentive for the business entrepreneur to start a business unless you're on a Bitcoin standard. And this is where I think a Bitcoin standard not only creates a more fertile environment for business owners to create a business, but it also unlocks the 2 billion people in the world who don't have a bank account. There's around 2 billion people who don't have a bank account. How many Albert Einsteins are there in Africa or South America or Asia or Central America who have incredible business ideas that can create an incredible amount of wealth for the global economy, but they simply can't get their business idea to the people, to the masses, to the retail, because they don't have an effective way to raise capital. They don't have a bank account. They can't get funding, okay? And even if they did get funding, the government would probably take their money off them and steal their idea. So this is another thing that Bitcoin changes. All of a sudden, every single person in the world has a bank account. It's a Bitcoin bank account. You got a $50 smartphone, you can grab one of these puppies, you can download a Bitcoin wallet, and you've got access to global capital markets. If you got a $50 smartphone and you're in Africa, South America, Asia, all of a sudden you have a bank account. You have the same bank account that Michael Saylor has. You're abiding by the same rules. And I think these are just some things that people don't think about when we're thinking about a transition to a Bitcoin standard. How many Albert Einsteins are there in the 2 billion people who are unbanked? When all of those ideas get unlocked and brought to the global marketplace, the GDP growth and boom that we see in the world is going to be unprecedented. And I don't see why global GDP couldn't be growing by 10, 20, 30, 40% per year for a lot of years. And again, I think we could even get more philosophical and spiritual and start asking the questions like on a Bitcoin standard, if there's less war, I'm not sure if Bitcoin would completely eradicate war, but I think it would certainly create a lot less war when we are more globally cooperated as we are using the same money. Does this mean you just simply get people in higher powers focusing on problems that actually matter and creating wealth? I think so.
And how do you account for that GDP growth? You can, like, that's why it's an outdated metric in that sense too. Like if you have less wars because the economic system incentivizes you to not have as much war, like that's priceless. Like that's not considered in GDP, like that doesn't even make sense. It's wild.
Exactly. These old metrics aren't fit for a Bitcoin standard.
It's incredible. Have you given thought, really quick, actually, have you given thought to any, like, do you have any new metrics that you are like, hey, I gauge Bitcoin in this, or like this might be the metric we use going forward? I mean, that's just not talked about that much. I don't know. I know people have given it thought, but like, how are we going to view things like preparing for a Bitcoin standard? Like what are some of these things? Like how does, storing it the right way, you buying it and having it so you can lend against it or you can use it in the future. But are there some of these metrics that you use or you've thought about, like, hey, we're going to have to use this going forward? Or to me, it's fascinating. We're future forward thinking here, but like you said, I think it's coming quicker than the average person really realizes. I think, again, like we spoke about earlier, we're in this monetary transition right now. We are living through another Bretton Woods as we speak.
I will say the only metric I won't be using is the power law. I wouldn't even wipe my ass for that thing. I don't think that's useful for the next 20 years. But in all seriousness, there's a couple of cool little calculators I play around with. A mutual friend of ours in the show, Mark Moss, has a really cool little retirement calculator that shows you how you can kind of like borrow against a percentage of your Bitcoin stack and, assuming what price that Bitcoin is increasing by each year. It shows you how much you can kind of retire and live on your Bitcoin. It's a cool little website. There's also another one on GitHub called When Moon. It's spelled W-E-N, Moon. I believe an Australian created it. Love the name. But that also does something similar. So it's a little calculator. It's a little metric that I think is not used enough. I don't really have anything pertaining to like global economic growth, which is kind of the topic we were talking about. But those are a few little underrated gems.
How do you suggest people really prepare themselves for, what's going to happen, whether it's in the fiat world now and then transitioning and bridging to the Bitcoin standard? Is it just, save more than you spend and save in Bitcoin, hopefully actually having a retirement, being a part of this new society, this new monetary system going forward? Like what are the ways you are preparing yourself for everything we're living through? Because again, me personally, I think it's going to get crazier in many regards before it really gets much better, quote unquote. Again, we just talked about EU stealing its citizens' wealth. I mean, if we sit here and think that every person's going to be okay with that, I think we have another thing coming. So I feel like it's going to get crazier. So what are you doing to prepare for this bridge, this transition to get from this fiat dystopian, really dystopian era to this new fiat or this new Bitcoin standard?
So I believe the solution is to become a 21st century digital renaissance man. So that's a different book I'm writing on the more nomading aspect of Bitcoin. So, firstly, before I even get into that and how it relates to Bitcoin, what is a Renaissance man? Well, in the prior Renaissance, all of the famous names that are well known today, like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, all of the great minds of that Renaissance, they specialized in lots of different disciplines. And they were the Renaissance men. They dominated. Okay, they lived incredible lives. I believe today, if you want full sovereignty to weather this transition, I believe you need to become a digital Renaissance man. But I think there are multiple disciplines to sovereignty that you need to master or at least be aware of if you are going to get true, complete, full sovereignty and become a Renaissance man. So most Bitcoiners are aware with the importance of having financial sovereignty, right? You got your Bitcoin, you got it on your own hardware wallet, it's backed up correctly, and that is a great example of having financial sovereignty. I thought I was a sovereign little kid strutting around Australia in 2020. Before the lockdowns happened, nothing could stop me. I had a little bit of a pep in my step. I thought I was unbeatable because I was obviously saving in Bitcoin for 3 or 4 years. I thought I was the most badass, kid getting around. I got my life savings in Bitcoin. I'm sovereign, baby. And I learned very quickly in 2020 that I did not have complete sovereignty. I was not a digital Renaissance man. I was not as much of a badass as I thought I was. I was a bitch because I didn't have geographical sovereignty, and I very importantly did not have entrepreneurial sovereignty. I had a gym business in 2020. The government just said, sorry, you're unessential, you're spreading germs. Close that thing. And my only source of income at the time was gone. And I was completely reliant upon government in 2020. So I did not have control over my revenue streams, entrepreneurial sovereignty. And I did not have a passport or a way to get out of Australia and go and give myself bodily autonomy, geographical sovereignty. I didn't have sovereignty over what I could do in my own body. Okay. So this is where I believe, this is just something I do myself. I haven't lived in Australia for 3 years. I've lived abroad. So I like to give myself geographical sovereignty. That is obviously a big bonus if you have a business as well. And then speaking of businesses, I only like to make money if I'm able to control the revenue streams. So that is entrepreneurial sovereignty, taking sovereignty over your revenue streams, going and finding work in a place where you are not controlled or liable to things you might say about politics, and you have somebody fire you from your 9 to 5. So this is where I really encourage Bitcoiners to explore more than just buying Bitcoin and just waiting for it to go to $1 million per coin. That was me for 4 years between 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. I was content. I was happy. I was thinking maybe in the future, maybe in 20 years, I'll be able to retire on Bitcoin because maybe it'd be worth $1 million a coin. And upon reflection, that was a wrong way to go about the world. I was passive. I was slightly nihilistic. And it wasn't until about 2021 that I came to the realization that, hang on a minute, there's more to sovereignty. Why don't I just go and create the world I want to live in, as opposed to wait for Bitcoin to do what it is inevitably going to do? And that's what I've done over the past 3 to 4 years. Created businesses, tried to provide value to the marketplace, which is why I'm a massive fan of your podcast, because again, you're another Bitcoiner who gets this. You're creating value, you're spreading education, you're creating a business. You're not just reliant upon Bitcoin number go up, like I think a lot of Bitcoiners are in space. And again, no shade on that. It was me for 4 years. I understand the mindset and the psychology. And I think just providing more value to the marketplace and really trying to level up myself in the realm of business has been a big mind shift. Taking complete sovereignty over my revenue streams, incredibly empowering. So those are some things that I think about when we start talking about mastering this transition. I just encourage the people to become a digital Renaissance man.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Great way to end it too. Any last thoughts, and what are you working on right now that you would like to share?
No final thoughts except for the fact that most people are just simply too bearish on Bitcoin. They're going to sell way too early. I think A lot of people are going to lose a lot of money by being too bearish on Bitcoin. I genuinely believe that. I mean, it's some people think I'm just saying that just to get clicks and just be bullish. I'm not. Like, if I wanted to just get clicks, I would say the power law, the power law, the power law, the power law is going to 1 million. Like, that's the most bullish model in the world, and I just think it's bullshit. So it's anyway. I genuinely believe most people are bearish on Bitcoin, and they're going to sell far too soon. So please don't do that. That's my probably final thought. I'm not really working on much. I just talk shit on YouTube. So if you want to tell me I'm crazy, you can do that on Twitter. I shit talk on Twitter, and I talk a lot of shit on YouTube. I have my personal YouTube channel where there's a lot of shit being spoken. Then we have some more educational videos on the bitcoinnews.com YouTube channel. We do interviews with big name guests. Sam Thamau interview coming up in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, always working on everything related to YouTube and Bitcoin. My life mission is helping to orange pill the world. And I've just found that working in the video side of content creation is the best way for me to leverage my skill set to not only educate people about Bitcoin myself, but also help other people amplify their message and help them educate people about Bitcoin. So that's all I'm working on, brother. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Luke Mikic, thank you so much for being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters. Thank you, sir.
If you like the interview that we just did with Luke Mikic, you're going to love the one that we just did with fighter pilot, Top Gun graduate, naval aviator George Bodine, and his journey to Bitcoin and why he is now all in Bitcoin. It is his retirement plan. You're not going to want to miss that. It's already got over 36,000 views. Go check that out here. We'll see you inside. You're going to love it.